Welcome to the Undefined Leader, where we reimagine leadership, redefine work, and get curious. Today, we're curious about change management. So, getting ready for this episode, I spoke to a few people that are in corporate world, and I said, what is the first thing that comes to your mind when I say change management? And a few sentences came out of it, which was, here we go again. I bet I'm going to sit through a 2-3 hour training session, or here comes a lot more work that I'm going to have to do for the next few months, and nothing's actually going to change and benefit. And then when we look at the leader's point of view, more than 50% of change leaders report burnout. And for what? Because only 70% of change initiatives fail. So today we're going to talk about, why is it failing? Why does everyone seem to hate it so much and is burnt out about it, and what we can do about it? Derek, why do you think more than 70% of change initiatives fail?
I think there's a lot of reason. I remember when I first came across that statistic while I was in grad school of really thinking like, what? Like one, two, like how are they tracking too, you know, on all this? And we actually had to read the whole report and everything. I think it was from McKinsey that came out of there. And so when you dive into when they studied it, and obviously it was from a sample size, they haven't studied every change initiative, that they actually found that it wasn't so much because of strategy. It was because of people, and it's because people are involved is why they fail for a whole host of reasons. And one of the big ones is just that people just resist it and they don't want to do it, so they find ways to make it not work because they don't want to do it. So I think like a lot of the things around change are actually, as much as this pains me to say, less about the logic of it and more about the emotions of it.
It makes sense. And it makes sense that we would resist it and burn out from it, because it sounds like a cycle. Well, if 70% of them fail, then the next time around a change initiative comes up, based off of our past experiences, we're thinking, oh, this is just going to fail again. So then now we're more resistant to it. And then so it's this constant cycle that we're going through. Change is going to happen. We're living in a world where change is happening every single day. So we have to have change initiatives. So let's try to figure out why are we so resistant about it, and kind of try to figure out how to win going forward.
Because you're right, you're talking about a cycle, and then now you get into change fatigue also, right, as part of that cycle. And there is a myth here that I would kind of like to attempt to debunk a little bit.
Tell me.
And that myth is that people fear change. I just don't think that that's true, because if you step back for a second, most of the things that we hope, dream, and wish would happen are changes. Like change the car that we drive, or change the house that we live in, or change the job that we have, or change the career that we're going down, or change the way our body looks. Like it all, like the thing that most people want is change. So I resist. We're talking about resist. I resist the idea that people fear change. And then I think it also gives leaders an excuse to not look deeply into why did their change initiative change, because they can just write it off. Well, people just hate change, or people just fear change, and that's why it didn't work. And now they're going to be in that cycle that you're talking about of continually doing things that don't work. So what do you think about that, Alex, about people fearing change or hating change?
I'm not going to argue with you at all. I think it makes complete sense. Do you think when we say people hate change, I think you're right. It's not about just the change itself. It's more of the process of it and how it makes people feel during it. So, for example, I know I've been through a lot of change in organizations, and I know there are times, very much so, that I was burnt out and I hated it. But it was more of the approach of how it was communicated to me than the actual change itself. So it was a very top down. Somebody above me already made the decision. I have no say in it. The decision has been made, and now someone's coming to me and say, Alex, here's what you need to do. Here's the change that's happening. So now it just ends up being a task, and there's no why behind it. There's no really context behind it. And I feel like I don't have a sense to be heard and have a say in what's going on. And that's usually why I personally hate it. And I would assume a lot of people that say, I hate change, I would say that that's probably it. What do you
Yeah,
think?
because the person that says, "I hate change," if suddenly, the next day, they inherited or won the lottery, they're not gonna say, "No, no, I'm not gonna take that money because I hate change." Like, no one's gonna do that. So the logic doesn't hold up, but I think what people hate is pain, and I think what people fear is loss. So I think when it comes out of, people fear change or people, hate change, what people really fear is that I'm losing something here. Like the reason that things are changing, is going to be in a way that I don't benefit from and it's going to cost me something. And just like you were saying, or just the process to do this is going to be so painful because I don't understand maybe how this is going to benefit me. Like as humans, we're really bad at playing the long game too. Is this pain to go through right now even worth it? Even if the outcome is ultimately going to make my life better down the road. We're so bad at that. It's like the recency bias and the near term a type of bias that we have towards things of not. It just like it reminds us like why it's not even worth it to go
Mhm.
through it. So I think again going back to the logic versus the emotion, which again is I prefer logic and things like that, but it's change is something that everyone feels. And again, part of the pain is you typically don't get to understand why it's happening. So you make an emotional reaction on resisting it or accepting it versus a logical one.
Love how clearly you just communicated that. So if you feel like someone on your team is going to resist the change or hate the change that's coming up, they're probably feeling one of two things. It's going to cost me something, I'm going to lose something, or it's going to be more painful. And one of those two things outweigh the benefit of going through that process.
Mhm.
I like that. Yeah.
Yeah, because so one, just from like a start, like when we're talking about like change management or, some type of change initiative, like as the leader, you're either the instigator of this, or Alex, like you were saying, like you're not the instigator. Someone else instigated this
Mhm.
but it's your job now to make it happen or to get everyone else. And those are two very different things. And what we probably naturally find is it's much easier to make change happen when we're the instigator. And I think that's because we're bought into our own ideas. Like we understand the why, it's exciting, like we see the benefit. And so we're kind of maybe be able to naturally lead better in those scenarios where it's our idea to make the change. We instigated it. I think the scenario that you mentioned before, the change, a decision was made. It was not your decision, but it is your job to get buy-in to motivate people. And so I think Alex then it then starts though, I guess, with what steps you take to get yourself bought in or to find buy-in before you ever try to like get the team involved or communicate it the team. I think this is an important starting point of being the instigator or the person who has to figure this out, right?
Yeah, and I'm really glad you said that because when I was looking at all these different change management models that are out there, the one and I kept thinking to myself, now why does 70% of them fail even with all these great models out here? And you're right, people is a big part of it, but I think what I boiled it down to is the models are based off of a step by step what to do for a change recipient. So the employee feels like you're the change recipient versus a co-creator. And so I think that's where the buy-in comes from is do you feel and do your employees and team members feel like they are a part of the change and they're co-creator of this idea? Or do they just feel like here goes Derek again, where he's trying to find ways to get my buy-in and he's trying to find ways to get me to make this change.
Yeah. There's a quote that comes to mind when you said that, and I don't know who said it, so I'm sorry. I cannot attribute to whoever said it, but the quote is, "People never resist change; they resist being changed."
Mm,
I think it's just because as humans we're hardwired for predictability, comfort, our identity, of who we are. Like that's a real tough one. Is this change like kind of affecting our identity? or even like our company identity. And so, like I said before, like when you kind of dive into that report where the 70% number comes from, it's not often from a lack of a strategy or a lack of a plan. It's it's people factors. It's because the change fatigue, people are just like that. No, like we've had too much change. Like this is the last straw. So it's like, I don't even care what it is. We're not going to do it. It's poor communication, the lack of buy-in, and just oftentimes too low trust. If we've got an organization that's implementing a change, what's the previous track record? So like you were saying before, the cycle, if this has failed and then this has failed and then this has failed, trust is going to be so low, that, well, this is going to be the one that this is going to be the change that fixes it, that it's pretty much doomed to fail just because of low trust.
Yes. And credibility. You have less credibility because your team members know that it didn't work. The last few ones we didn't work. I'm also going to add to that urgency. I think sometimes, like, I know I've been in this position before where a change idea might be a good idea and I might actually be bought into this. And now I'm excited and we're like, okay, let's go in, let's work hard, let's make this change happen. And then now the leader comes in halfway through this project and says, here's something extremely important where we need to go focus on here and it has to be done now. And so when that happens too many times, I think it creates that change fatigue you were talking about, where both could be true. You could be completely bought into both those things, but you can't put all of your focus into multiple different areas. And then sometimes leaders even forget that that was a change that we're working on. And now they're just so hyper focused on another area of the business too. And so at that point, what are the employees feeling then? All right, well, why did I just do months and months of work for this thing if the leader didn't even care about it and forgot about it? And now we're just moving in this direction. Now this is the next most important thing.
Yeah. You said good idea, but I think we kind of have to start a bit with the assumption that these change initiatives are a good idea, or the company wouldn't try to do it.
Mm-hmm.
Right. It's not like, hey, everyone, we have a bad idea. Let's like, it started as a good idea. Whether it's correct is different. That's different than good. Like whether we actually did the proper market research and, properly looked at the data. And I know we're going to, at some point, Alex, devote a whole conversation about decision making. And we're straying into that right now of decision making, but kind of just leaving that to the side. No one would have said, yes, let's do this if it was a bad idea. Right. So, and I think that's like kind of like the disappointment too, that a lot of leaders have of, we're going to do this. It's so exciting. And then the team is just like, no, like it doesn't make that leap. And then it's like, but it was a good idea. This is going to make your life so much better. This is going to make our customers' life so much better. This is going to help the business so much. Like, why did it go nowhere? It was a good idea.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you're right. It's because of everything that happens before the decision versus the things that happen after the decision, and doing things in the right way, in the right order, just so it ever even had a chance of being successful to begin with. I just think so many good ideas were doomed to fail from the moment of decision.
Yeah, I agree. So we threw out a lot of different reasons that we think change fails or doesn't stick around. So just to summarize some of them right now, it's a top-down implementation. So people felt like they weren't heard, understood, they weren't co-creators of this decision, and were just command and control approach. That's one of them. We said lack of trust and credibility, especially from past experiences if they failed, which stats show it probably failed. Also, the flavor of the month feeling of that urgency of what is the most important thing. So, lack of trust and credibility. We talked about lack of communication and authenticity. Let's dive into that a little bit more. What do you think leaders fail at with communication authenticity when it comes to change management?
In my opinion, again, it's because they don't communicate emotionally around the change. Like it becomes like a very logical, like, I mean, poor communication is poor communication. So it means it lacks the logic and it lacks the emotion. But I think where a lot of leaders get into is, they might say, hey, we're making this change logically because of this number, this metric, this number. And they leave out what I was saying, that change is emotional. And we fear pain, and and we fear, and so they're not acknowledging the emotions that people are going to feel because of that change. And there's even another quote too. Again, I need to get better at attributing quotes, but I did scribble it down because I remembered it again, from back in the day, and I wanted to find it. But it says, "We think that change fails because people just don't get the logic, but that's not true. Change fails because people don't feel safe." And then be able to understand, like, this thing, again, a good idea, it might be logically sound, and we might be able to like explain why it was a good idea with logic, but it doesn't mean that people are going to feel good about it or feel safe about it, or all those emotions. So that's kind of like the first thing that comes to my mind on that. What about you?
For me, the first thing that comes to my mind is I've sat through meetings where leaders talk to us about change management and this big change initiative coming up. And every single time I felt like it was a sales pitch where there was a lack of authenticity and a lack of context. And I felt like I was being pitched at. And the entire purpose of that meeting was to get my buy in. And I feel that in that meeting. And the challenge, I think, what they're doing there is they're focusing too much on the positives and not really the realistic threats and costs and the obstacles that are going to come our way for it.
Mhm.
So it's almost like an example of, let's say, you have a really big gym goal. You have maybe it's losing weight or getting muscle mass or whatever. It's a very hard work that you have to put in. It's really hard work that you have to put in order to get those results. What if someone was pitching you this idea, but they didn't tell you, hey, Derek, you're going to have to wake up at 5 a.m. every single day and go to the gym for an hour every single day. You're going to have to cut these carbs that you love and this and this and this. What if they didn't show you all the cost and the pain and the loss, and they only told you your body's going to look ripped once you're done with this. All of your problems are going to be solved. That's how I feel those meetings go,
Mhm.
where I'm only being pitched the good things and there's no reality to it. And so then it almost feels like, does the leader know how hard this is going to be? Do they think that this initiative is going to be easy to implement? Do they realize how much hard work is going to get into it and how it's going to affect all of us on the team? Because we're also going to be the ones that are doing the work.
Yeah, I think that is kind of, again, the emotions versus the logic of it a little bit too, of even just to continue your metaphor there of, like, fitness, like, logically, calories and energy expenditure and all that, like, there is a mathematical equation that can tell somebody how to lose weight. Restrict your calories by 500 a day, times 7 days in the week is 3,500 calories, which equals 1 pound of either fat loss or muscle gain. So I could explain the logic, like, completely. Yeah, but if I leave out what it feels like to restrict your calories by 500, a day below, your body's needs and energies, yeah, I would be missing out. I would be missing a huge piece of this. All right, of the emotional side of what
Mm-hmm.
it goes through. Because if it were easy, no one would have an issue losing weight. But obviously, but it is easy from a mathematical, logical formula. Like, if you follow the math, it will happen. But then again, like, it doesn't happen for most people, and they struggle with it, and it's a huge challenge. Again, because the emotions, there's no acknowledgement of emotions in that conversation, about the numbers and the logic, or even like how much better you're gonna feel later. And we don't really care about the later. It's more about how I'm gonna feel now while I'm doing it.
And it's the lack of preparation for those feelings too. Like, what if 30 days in and you're just miserable? You're so sore. All you want to do is go out and get a pizza, and you're more likely to fail at that moment because no one prepared you for that moment of the emotional side of change as well. And so I think businesses, that's where the initiative fails. You start the initiative, you start going through it, and things get tough and no one was prepared for it and no one spoke about it beforehand, and now suddenly the initiative failed.
In in the realm of change and implementing change and change management, for leaders who are dialed into the emotional side, there's even a tool for this, the Kübler-Ross change curve, and it's basically a way to map the emotional journey that people who are going through change are going to go through. It's actually really similar. It's an adaptation of the grief process. Because again,
Mm.
change is, again, what we fear is a loss. We don't want to have loss. And a lot of times we're associating, even in the business sense, change with this idea of loss. Like even if it's just a loss of my habits or loss of my comfort zone or loss of ways that we've done something before, like there is a grieving process that we need to go through in a change management period. And so, Alex, maybe some of that almost like that ick or something that that you feel when change is being sold to you is, in my opinion, a little bit of maybe a lack of acknowledgement of the grieving process, and it's giving you too much at once, and you're not far enough along in the grieving process to even be ready for listening about the outcomes or anything like that. And so, like, basically in the curve change, the idea is you you try to, even when you look at your team, you try to kind of like map a little bit of where the different people on the team are probably going to be in the change curve, but even expect the different phases so that you as the leader trying to manage change aren't taking their reactions personal. So I think a lot of times, like groups will get like 2 to 3 steps in, and then maybe like, what, the leader's like, this is just too much. I didn't expect all of this. Forget it. And now change fatigue, low trust. And yeah, so it's a horrible cycle on things. A lot of people are familiar with like the grieving process, like the stages of grief. Are you familiar with that?
Yes, and I am fascinated that the grieving process is similar to the change management process. Obviously, different extremes, but it's fascinating that as humans we go through that. And guess what? There is a grieving process, and it feels good when you're grieving, knowing that there's a process and knowing that there's an end to how you're feeling right
Mhm.
now, and then there's a different stage that starts, and you're preparing yourself for it. And
Yeah.
so what if we knew that as employees, and change cycle as well, of knowing where, how you're feeling, knowing there's going to be a better out of it, and knowing that the next phase is going to be different. But also there's grief support groups. And I think that's the challenge with our businesses too, is when a change initiative happens, it's all task oriented. Where's the support group? Where's the support and help, and knowing where in the process you are and feeling heard and being able to push through those challenging, difficult times.
Yeah. And where's the support process? Now I think we're
Mhm.
getting into leadership here. Is does the leader even again recognize the emotional aspect of this change, or are they just so focused on the logical of just trying to sell you of why this is such a good idea? Look at the logic, like, and then leaders getting mad at you that you just don't get it, versus no, this there is a cycle, there's this curve change, there are stages of grief, because again, even the best changes, we do have to go through a mourning period or a sense of loss. So the first stage, there's 7 stages in this curve change, and it is again a helpful tool. People can look it up if they want, the Kübler-Ross curve change. And stage 1 is shock. So again, it's a predictable reaction that leaders should be expecting, not taking it personal, and be ready to spend as much time there as needed in an emotional conversation before we're ready to move to the next phase. So the shock is, wait, what? For a lot of employees, it's like, I didn't even know that that was a problem, or I didn't even know that that was something we needed to solve. That phase, people could get through that phase sometimes like pretty quick. It's just the initial news, the initial reaction, and then phase two, step two, kind of is a little bit more of a time thing, and that one is denial. So part of denial can be, what, this won't really affect me, or I, it's not gonna, it's gonna,
It's
other
never
people.
going to work.
Yeah, all of those things are instead of actually processing the change and getting on board, we're instead looking for evidence that this isn't true and that this isn't going to happen. And that's where we're like directing our energies. Phase 3 is anger and frustration. Like, this sucks so much. Who thought that this was a good idea? Like, this is just like the dumbest thing, And so that again is a processing phase. Then phase 4 is depression. Like, why even bother fighting anymore? Like, why? I just don't care anymore. Like all of those sentiments. And then if you can make it through that phase, and as a leader, if you can kind of again help people through that phase, now the curve was going down, and now the curve starts to go up. Again, the change curve. So now it starts to trend up. Stage 5 is experimentation. Okay, maybe I'll try it once. Okay, I'll finally watch the video. Okay, I'll take a look. I'll give it a little bit of a chance. Stage 6 is an attitude adjustment of, you know what? Maybe it's not as bad as I was expecting. And then stage 7 is integration. Well, this is just how we do things.
That's good. That's good. And I can see why 70% of change initiatives fail, because all along that way, it's so easy for the leader to say, you know what? All right, but you're right. Let's just not do it. And then so the next stage never actually comes from it as well.
Yeah, they weren't expecting these stages or predicting these. And so, yeah, to because it's not until like stage 5 where people are like, okay, I'll give it a chance.
Mhm.
And yeah, that is tough to be prepared for that, to just expect it, to not take it personal. Again, we're making the assumption that it's a good idea, and we're not talking about the decision itself. That's a whole other idea. So I'm operating on assumption that this is something that would benefit people, our customers, like the reason we're doing it. Yet even those change initiatives fail. Like that was kind of the report. It's not a bad thing that people just win and they fought and it was a bad idea and we're not going to have it. These are things that would be good, and yet most of them fail in it because I think the leaders just themselves surprised at how much resistance they got on something that's a good idea.
It's also not a linear process. It's a roller coaster. It's a curve. There are things happening. So I'm going to throw something out here because our entire podcast is about Undefined Leader, where we are reimagining the way that we were educated and learning how to be leaders. So I really like what you just told me about this curve. But if I was to reimagine it, I think there's a step before the first stage, and I think you can avoid the shock stage.
Tell me about it.
Because why are they shocked? They're shocked because it's still a top-down approach of decision making. And so they had no idea it was coming. They had no idea that this decision was already made and they have no say in it. So they're shocked and then they're angry and it goes on. But what if you create an environment of collaboration and you co-created these decisions together?
Mhm.
So they saw it coming, they were a part of the decision making process, and you kind of bypass that shock stage. Do you think
Yeah,
that's
I
doable?
agree. I think people support what they helped create. So yeah, and a lot of this too, like just the realistic side of this too is the size and scope of the team or the organization that we're talking about, right? If we're a large company, the reality is you can't include everybody in it, right? There's going to be decisions that get made that it's just not possible. We can't have thousands of people necessarily. I mean, there's still probably ways, with like surveys and data collection. All right, if we're a much smaller organization, there's really no excuse not to involve everybody. That's just bad decision making on things. So I do think like there is some context into it, and sometimes too there's like sensitive info that not everyone gets access to, so there's so much context. But just in general, I'm completely on board of that. Like, why did it have to be a shock?
Yeah. But even if they weren't a part of the decision making, maybe during town halls or something, it's something that you're looking out into the future of. Here's some obstacles we see in our business. Here's some opportunities we see that the business could move into. So you start planting some ideas into people's mind. And so by the time you're actually there, even if no one else could be a part of that decision, it's something that's been floated around and it didn't come out of left field. And there's some context behind it, like, so it's not just here's what we're doing tomorrow, and there's context behind why we're doing it, and having that authenticity of, hey, it's going to be hard at the same time, but then also giving enough leeway so you're not saying, okay, here's this change and it's happening tomorrow, knowing that there's a shock period, knowing that there's an anger period, knowing that the employees are going to go through this cycle, and being able to give that time. So, leaders for every single one of those stages that you have, leaders also have some kind of action step, some kind of support mechanism for each of those stages.
No, I completely agree. Like, yeah, even if people can't necessarily have any type of control inside of the decision making process that's coming to the change, because again, there's just like the change that we're talking about could be so many different things too, right? The change that we're talking about could be an owner who's going to decide to retire and step down. He can't really involve people in that decision process. So it's going to be a shock. There's no getting around, but there are things that maybe they could have started hinting towards it and all that, but the reality is like it's going to come to it. There's going to be some type of shock or, surprise or things like that involved with it. Sometimes you just can't get around it. But even in things where like people can't have control, there's still ways to figure out how they can have a voice or how they could have been more prepared in owning their role and things like that. So they're not reliant on that person. So I completely agree. The less proactive, the more shock I think is going to happen.
Okay, so not every change fails. There are leaders out there that are really good at change management and they have change initiatives that succeed and they stick with the company and the culture. So, what do you think those leaders are doing right?
I think we've already covered some of what I would call the first two on my list. And I think part of communicating emotionally is understanding the right story of things. And I think that is like part of the communication skill here too, is kind of understanding the story of why we're doing this and how we're going to feel and how it's going to go. And then I think also like what you said, involve people as early as possible. Every situation is going to be different, but as early as possible. So then the one that I was going to add on to what we've kind of talked about is also to just to normalize the change curve, to normalize resistance to change, that is not bad. That is not a sign that it's a bad idea or a bad thing. That we understand that as like, hey, we have to make a change. Understand. I'm empathetic to the loss of productivity or all these other things, and it is the phase that we're in right now. I would resist too if I were you, and just kind of like normalize and let's talk about it and let's hang out in this phase of the change curve together. Even like as the leader who instigated this, here's how I would push back on it too, and just have that ability to hang out there. What about for you?
Yeah, I agree with all of those. And now that we've said the word support a lot, I think that's a really big part of it. And after this episode, I really want to brainstorm with you too of for taking each of those 7 phases and trying to say for a leader, what is the support that you can give a team member that is going through this phase for every single phase? So, because I do think sometimes leaders put too much emphasis on the first part of initiating the change and that conversation and then kind of forget everyone else and just say, go and do your work now. So I think consistent support throughout the process is crucial. Consistent communication, clear expectations. So, and clear authenticity. Biggest one being it's not going to be easy. Here are the challenges and preparing for the stages, preparing for obstacles that are going to come your way because when you are changing something, there's always some kind of obstacle that happens along the way. So, is the leader prepared and acknowledges that there are challenges coming up? And do we have a game plan for those at the same time? And then support doesn't actually only have to be on an emotional level, but support also a scope of work support. So if you're
Yeah.
tasking a team of people to go through some kind of change, what is the expectations and what are the scope of work that we're going through? And then meeting regularly to make sure that they have the resources and tools and time that they need in order to make this change happen. So they're not isolated alone in this journey of change.
Yeah, because even that, and I would love to have that conversation about brainstorming each of the phases. But even I think, but right before that too, like if you're a leader going through some type of change, happened, and you're in the midst of trying to navigate this with your team, of taking the time to map where every single individual in your team is on the change curve, so that as a prep, like you were talking about, for the communication and like the one-on-ones, so that you are prepared for each different one-on-one, kind of already knowing where they're at on the change curve, because those are going to be different conversations and different support, like you were talking about. Because like there's always a few people on the team that are like, oh yeah, cool, fine, they're they accelerated through the stages a little faster, and some people are way behind. Some people are still, you know, some people on the team are in the experimentation of trying it out and playing around with it, while some people are still in denial. And if the all the one-on-ones are kind of handled the same, right? We're missing on both ends of it on that too. So I think that's one of the ways that that tool can be helpful for our leaders to map it out of where everyone is and then prep for those one-on-ones and the support like you were talking about, because in the different phases, yeah, they do need different support. And this to me, I think is a mistake that happens all the time where, let's say let's just do a classic example, right? There's going to be like some type of an all hands or a town hall or a all team email that announces the change. So now we have shock. And then basically the person who usually from up on top, especially if it was a big enough change, now says something like, okay, now you're going to get with your, direct manager basically on how to implement this. And it jumps straight to execution. And now all of the one-on-ones or all the squad meetings or team meetings are 100% focused on executing on the change versus some emotional one-on-ones. How do we feel about this? Again, because of the change curve.
Yeah. So we're saying instead of hyper focusing on task, focus on the person first, focus on the emotional side of the person first and where they are on that curve, giving them the support they need. And then the task is secondary. So they feel they're where they're supposed to be emotionally in order to even be successful with a task that's in
Yeah,
front of them.
because it's just not until they're in that fifth
Mhm.
stage of experimentation that the tasks are even going to get accomplished in any type of meaningful way. So it just doesn't do any good. This is again why 70% or so of these things fail, because again, like the order of of operation. So this is where my logic strategic side comes in. Uh, but when I think back personally to me being the leader, trying to create change in teams that I've ran or organizations that I've ran, I can also map a lot of mistakes that I made. Of like when I look to the ones that failed, I approached it leaning too heavily into my strategy brain and too heavily into, well, once everyone understands the logic, they'll be completely on board. And I personally messed up that I needed to be able to communicate it emotionally too, and that it's everyone feels change, and they have to grieve the sense of loss before we're ready to be logical about it.
Yeah. And I can see how burnout comes from change management, from bad change management as well. I mean, I know I've been through it so many times and I can see very clearly when I started having burnout. And you're right, at some point, you're like, what's the point?
Hmm.
And at some point, if you don't trust your leader, the person that is trying to make the change and implement the change, then you may never leave that second stage of shock, anger,
Yeah,
and you're like, I'm not gonna implement it. You might get stuck in the denial phase. And now if you've created an environment where your team is just saying, let's just wait it out. Let's just wait it out. The leader will let it go after a while. I'm not going to implement it. Now you're in trouble. So this is such an important skill to have as a leader and such a difficult skill to have as a leader. And I think we've only covered such a small portion of it because there are careers out there where people specialize in change management.
Hmm.
Eric and I do not specialize in this. This is just our interpretation of change management and our thoughts on it. But it's definitely something that as a leader, I'm going to be focusing on more. And I'm going to be trying to help other leaders focus on this too.
Yeah, if people want to dive deeper and they're looking kind of like for directions on where to go, I mean, for one, we'll put up an article on our website right now. Now we've got a website, the undefinedleader.com. So we'll put some more info there and an article on the website. But I would also encourage people to Google intentional change theory, ICT. I studied it when I was in grad school, and there's just so much more there. Like this had, like you were saying, this is a specialty that has been around for a bit, and there is so much study and thought and research that has been going to it. But just to kind of like give a little teaser about intentional change theory, it's this idea that people will only change when they're inspired by a vision of their ideal self. And so like as a leader, you kind of have to recognize, again, kind of like the loss, the sense of loss and the grief in the morning, and help people realize like what it is of their ideal self, because it's personal change. The change affects people. It's not just the logic on things like that. So it's a really fascinating rabbit trail to go down. Intentional change theory, ICT.
Well, if you want to learn more too, go to our website, theundefinedleader.com. We'll have an article there and we'll brainstorm some ideas for the leader, how the leader can support an employee of every stage of that curve. And we'll add that infographic to the article too.